18. We passed it. So we're at 1941. 1676, so a little bit further down. We found him! Yeah, so Chris's 3 siblings are all in the same row. His sister is here, and then Fred and Mark are beside each other over there. Chris is resting just over here. So each grave does have a number. Chris's number is currently sunken into the ground, so that will have to be fixed. It's not often that I hear in this community that somebody woke up one morning and they were all of a sudden homeless. It's usually because there was a series of multiple events that happened, oftentimes out of their control, that got them here. Chris passed away on the 6th of March, just before the pandemic in 2020. We hadn't seen him in a day or two, which is really unusual. So Chris was somebody that we would see almost every day at Sanctuary, whether it was a weekday or a weekend. This was home, this was sort of home base. This is where he met up with his friends and had access to the things that he, that he looked for and needed. Every now and then we wouldn't see him for a day or two, but we would hear from him, like he knew my phone number off his head. And so it was a little bit unusual that we hadn't seen him for a couple days. And then we got a phone call to say that he was at our friend's apartment and he was found dead. And he likely had been there for about a day or two before he was found. We came to Toronto because my mom's sister was already here. We were lucky that we already had people here. Somebody sort of helped, plant the seeds for us. And so we were able to live with them when we came here. I think growing up, having moved a lot of times between countries and then between schools and then having to learn different systems at each place that I moved to, I think it showed me how survival is dependent on how well you can navigate those systems. All of those things we were really lucky and really privileged to have access to, but I think of, not everybody has the same opportunities. The work at Sanctuary, especially in this neighborhood, is often contested. I think there's often a narrative that I hear where, people who are relatively more privileged are pitted against people who are relatively less. I hope that we get to a place where we ask why, and that we let curiosity be our teachers so that we actually better understand people's stories. Why are people living in encampments? Why is somebody needing to, use your back alley as a public washroom? Why are there so many people riding the King streetcar overnight to stay warm instead of focusing on just the surface level things? Honestly, we just want to be a community for people who are often excluded from the world because of larger systemic structures. So people that we really want to center in this community are people whose voices are often ignored. So they might be people who are homeless or underhoused, people who might struggle with addiction barriers or mental health barriers, people who experience a lot of isolation. And our hope is that people experience a sense of belonging here and a sense of empowerment. Maybe, I think starting a couple years ago, maybe even the summer before the pandemic, we started seeing a lot more youth. A lot of this is because youth age out of the youth services in Toronto, and then there's just, where do they go? And so they often sort of go to a different community together. But we're also seeing a lot more new people coming. I think that's a reflection of the fact that food insecurity, for instance, is just skyrocketing across the city. It really wasn't until I started hanging out in this community when I realized that all of these various things that I was seeing were symptoms of giant policy failures. And so it became impossible to ignore politics. When I talk about homelessness now, I think about my friend Richard, who froze to death in his wheelchair down the street from me. And for me, these issues are about people that I have come to know and come to love. And so, in order to love people well, it also means that I want their circumstances to change. And so I think that's the difference between thinking about charity versus justice. I think when we think about charity work, it's easy to get stuck in, oh, just doing something for a poor person, for instance, and then leaving it at that, but not engaging the circumstances and asking questions for why the person is in poverty in the first place. I think real justice work means we're asking questions about why we even need to rely on donations. Why do we need to rely on charity? And what does it mean to change the structures that people are stuck in? And so for me, honestly, I would love to not have to work here. I would love to not have a job here, not because I don't like my job, but because working here means that we've got a huge societal failure in policies. And so I want those things to change. I want to change the things that keep people homeless. The sad part for me is that it's easier to support people after they've died than while they were alive. And I think the system almost makes it easier. The hard part often for us is figuring out and trying to execute what we knew our friends would have wanted. There's a city article from a couple years ago where they said that the median age of people who die who are homeless is 48, and that's like 30 years earlier than the average. I think of the 4 siblings who are buried out here, they all had not reached 50 yet. A lot of the reasons why people who are in the community die is all preventable. If people had housing, if people had access to safe supply, if people had access to resources, offer people housing and basic needs, I think blood is on our hands collectively. I think we're responsible for people dying, and I think we hear people talk about social murder, and I think this is the visible, tangible murders that we talk about by social policies and stuff. Chris was one of the first people that I met. Actually, it was him and a couple of his brothers and his really close friends. They were the ones that brought me to Sanctuary. And we quickly developed a friendship. He became like a big brother that I never had. The longer I spent here, there was more milestones in my life that he witnessed. And so really some of my most formative adulthood years were spent in this community, and he really did watch me grow up. Chris was one of the first people I told when I got engaged. And he was really excited for me. He was like, hey, can I walk you down the aisle? And he was joking, but I've known him long enough to know that he was also half serious. And I said, of course, there was no doubt about it. It's complicated because, conventionally it makes sense for my own father to walk me down the aisle. But I think this was also such a reflection of how this places my family as well. It was really the pandemic that made me realize just how much policies are either life or death for people. There was a lot of grief in terms of the number of people that I've lost. So a lot of the people that have died this year were people that I spent a lot of time with. And so the reality is sometimes I show up to work and I feel like I have to make new relationships all the time because people that I've spent years with have now all gone. Losing 39 people in 2 years, so that averages out to 18 deaths a year, which is more than 1 death a month. So that is not usual. But yet, the trend says it is usual. This is what we're seeing across other communities in the city. Lots of other communities are grieving multiple losses at once. Sometimes I think there's this idea that harm reduction is this really big abstract concept, but I think we don't realize that we actually practice harm reduction in our day-to-day lives already. So going to a party and having a designated driver, that is a form of harm reduction, right? Having condoms in public bathrooms is a form of harm reduction, or having it available to young people, that's a form of harm reduction. The idea of harm reduction is how do we make people's lives more dignified, and how do we ensure that people experience less harm? I think that safe injection sites are working, yeah. If anything, I think, because of limited funding, there's also limited hours right now. But in my ideal world, safe injection sites would be a 24/7 thing across the city. In the ideal world, safe supply would be a thing that would be accessible through any prescriber across the city. These things are working and they're saving lives. And And I think the really important thing is that people who are accessing these spaces are saying themselves that this is what's saving my life. And so for me, like, it's really important that we listen to those voices and let those voices take the lead. Sometimes I think in a charity mindset, people with privilege assume that we know what's best for other people, when that's not actually true. People who have survived, who have lived this, who are living this, they are the experts and they know, and I think we need to do a better job in listening. The friendships that I have in this community are the most rewarding part of this work. I also think that this community has taught me a lot about what it means to hope. And for me, like, hope is not just passive waiting around for things to be better. But I think hope is a discipline that I personally am learning to continue to train every day, to train myself to learn what it means to hope. Because I think hope is what has to keep us going. I think hope for me means knowing and holding on to the fact that, like, things can be better and should be better, and we have to actively work for it. And so this community of relationships is hoping with me. And it feels like we are really pushing towards something together, and there is a lightness in all that.